Well, this will come, but there's a picture. That's me in Shopper's Line. Well, there's a few pictures of me. Yeah, exactly.
Right. So,
well, they're going to show it, I think.
And I don't know.
Something like that. Anyway, that's what me and Mom and Ira. Oh, that's it. Of course I have. I spoke to the opening. The question is, have you been there? Well, it's close like that. You got to come and see. That's a torpedo. You know, they called it turned over when they were right there. That's me at a black church. Oh yeah, we have still about house. Next time you're, that is Aaron Buck. Yeah, it's great. That's the guy who played Aaron Buck.
Good luck.
We know that his stars can't afford to. I've been there. I get it. It's about, I don't remember when exactly. I'm speaking with them. I have no idea. I honestly don't recognize it. I know that's the
okay. No.
all right.
Do I have to?
Sorry, what was that?
I hope you didn't just fly away. We
So it's my unenviable task to ask everyone to be seated now. I know this feels like an old family reunion, and hopefully you'll have a lot of time to talk to each other after our plenary session. So if everyone can get seated, including our guest of honor, that would be great. And in case you're wondering, the pictures of Eric are there from his childhood. I just gave him a backhanded compliment. I told him, "You were quite handsome when you were young." And he said, "I really don't know how to take that." Anyway, it is with great pleasure that I, Manisha Sinha, Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut, and more importantly for this occasion, former Foner student, welcome all of you to our conference in celebration of Eric Foner's storied professional career, aptly titled, A People's Historian, Historian's Historian. I should say right at the outset that this is not really a retirement conference, because you know, as I speak, Eric is writing his next book. But seriously, we have a tall task before us, I'm told. We have to better, or at least match, an international celebration of Eric's career and work in the People's Republic of China, where he lectured to great acclaim at 7 universities and oversaw the release of 2 of his recent books in Chinese just last month. I think it speaks to the global reach and impact of his scholarship, of which we will be hearing a lot in the next 2 days. I thank all of you who have traveled to be with us this weekend, especially all the presenters who graciously agreed to be on the program, and all those who helped organize this event. In particular, I want to thank my partner in crime, May Nai, and Kim Phillips-Fine, who stepped in just when we needed her. Patrick Morrow, and especially Lindsay Dayton, really deserve all the credit for making this conference into a reality. Their organizing and technological skills translated ideas into programs, websites, flyers, posters, as if by magic. Above all, I want to thank Eric's partner, Lynn Garafola, the eminent dance historian and critic, whose input in planning this conference was invaluable. Finally, I would like to thank the following groups for their support of this conference: the Columbia University Department of History, the Office of the Executive Vice President for Arts and Sciences, the Herbert H. Lehman Center for American History, the Board of Visitors Program in the Department of History, the Joyce Chang History Department Fund, the Friends of the Department of History, I hope I got them all, Stuart, and the Provost's Office. So with due apologies to Shakespeare, friends, Americans, and countrymen, we come not to retire Eric, but to praise him. In my mind, at least, he will always remain the preeminent historian of the American experience, who taught me to passionately care about the history of my adopted country. Without further ado, I invite Seth Schwartz, the Lucius N. Littauer Professor of Classical Jewish Civilization and current chair of the History Department at Columbia, to help us inaugurate this conference in honor of Eric Foner, scholar, teacher, mentor, activist, public intellectual, nonpareil. Thank you.
Thank you, Manisha. On behalf of the History Department, I'd like to welcome everyone here and speak very, very, very briefly about Eric. When Eric arrived in the History Department in 1982, I was beginning work on my dissertation. In those years, the department was so balkanized that ancient historians like me and American historians might as well have been at different universities. Eric shouldn't take this the wrong way, but I actually have no memory of you at all. I remember Ken, but I don't remember you. Anyway, I only returned to my home base about 7 years ago, and my first brief contact with Eric took place shortly thereafter. It concerned a very, very routine matter. A PhD student of mine was getting in trouble. Eric was then director of graduate studies, and I confess that I was a little bit abashed about approaching so legendary a figure. But Eric dealt with me and with the issue, and most importantly with the student, with a truly exemplary mixture of firmness and what our ancestors called Menschlichkeit, human decency. This long-forgotten episode, in its very unmemorableness, reveals important truths about Eric. Just to recite the well-known statistics, Eric has published over 20 books, several of which have won important awards, including a Pulitzer Prize, which is something which is almost unthinkable to an ancient historian. Not to mention Bancroft, the Lincoln Prize. At Columbia, he has trained, according to our estimates in 413 Fairweather, about 74 PhDs. I just overheard him saying to someone that he thought it was about 80, so I don't know. There's a slight controversy on that point. Eric, as most of us know, has taught several famous lecture courses attended annually or nearly annually by over 200 undergraduates. He wrote and continues to write tirelessly for the press. I don't need to say in this room that Eric is and has been a towering figure in the field and in the university, and has cultivated a deep and ethical engagement in politics and public affairs. Not to mention the fact that at various times he served as president of the Organization of American Historians and also the American Historical Association, among other things. The same man, approximately 2012, was performing the most taxing and unrewarding of all departmental administrative posts, aside from the chair, the kind usually foisted on unsuspecting or overeager younger faculty. And he was doing it with commitment, grace, and decency. I've been told that this is typical. Eric is not reported ever to have turned down a departmental committee assignment. I don't know if that's really true, but that at least is the rumor. However irritating that assignment may be, the first thing that strikes me about all this information is how much energy Eric must possess and how much determination and what powers of concentration. The second thing that I would note is Eric's complete lack of pretension and entitlement. Few people in the department have published as much and in general do as much as Eric, and few people are as open and generous to students, colleagues, departmental staff with their time and abilities. Most people here probably know well what I have only recently been discovering. These traits are fully consistent with an intellectual, literary, indeed rhetorical style that values clarity and accessibility above all, that is entirely devoid of the sort of defensive or aggrandizing self-mystification to which even the most austere among us occasionally succumbs. I'm amazed by Eric's ability to make the most complex and sophisticated ideas seem completely self-explanatory. To me, these characteristics are all of a piece. Eric's exemplary membership in the department is part of a career in which immense talent has been placed in the service of a set of outward-looking ideals and goals, indubitably a strong vestige of the ethos of the old-time left, starting with the welfare of the department and its constituents, and reaching beyond it as far as the eye can see. On that note, please allow me to introduce the next speaker, Professor Lee Bollinger, president of Columbia University. Professor Bollinger has served as president of Columbia since 2002. He is the first Seth Low professor of the university and one of the country's foremost First Amendment scholars. Lee.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. I'm glad I could come and receive that. Thank you. So I'm here to congratulate Eric, and I just have 2 or 3 things to say very quickly. I could talk at length about the awards I've given to Eric. I think I'm the only one in the room who has given out 2 in the same year. So I have a specialty in handing out awards to Eric. And others will cover the arc of his career and the scholarly insights. I just have 3 angles of sort of vision on Eric that I want to mention. The first is Eric as a teacher. I have, of course, heard from students on countless occasions about what an incredible teacher Eric is. But then I asked Eric, we talked about having a seminar research program on Colombia and slavery. And Eric really took this on. He didn't have to do it, and he did. And it was a great service to the institution, which of course is still underway. But in the course of pursuing that, I met with him and his class to hear the students report on what their research had done. And the most interesting part of that was watching Eric interact with these students. There's a way in which you have a person who's just an absolute authority in a subject, and that can end up smothering, especially young people as they're trying to sort out what it is that they find and they believe and what they think are insights. And there was just nothing but the most gentle, encouraging, with some definite guidance in this with these young people, and I was deeply admiring of that. The second thing I want to say is that it's rare to have people really define an institution, especially one as filled with talented people as Columbia. But when you go places and you say, I'm from Columbia, et cetera, and they say, well, that's where Eric Foner is, isn't it? And you have a sense of the degree to which this person has achieved things in the world, again, in his scholarship, his teaching, his speaking to the public, that is quite striking. It's just one indication of what Eric has accomplished in his life. The third thing I want to say, and the last, is really about race in America, about affirmative action, because when I was involved in the affirmative action cases in the late 90s, early 2000s, and then more recently in some other cases, but not as intimately, we engaged Eric to be an expert, but more importantly, I've seen Eric on a number of occasions speaking about slavery and race in America. And one of the biggest problems I think we have today in the modern world is a kind of amnesia about the line of racism and discrimination in the country that still exists and continues on. It is Eric's capacity to talk about this in the way that he does that makes it more present in today's world. And that's a service to the country and to people that I think is unmatched. And I want to pay tribute to that particular quality here today. Congratulations, Eric, on a really stunning career.
Good evening, dear Eric. And thank you, Manisha and May and Lindsay and others who've made this remarkable gathering possible. My job is to introduce and moderate the first panel and introduce the speakers, but I can't forbear to say at least 1 or 2 things. You know, Eric will know this, and many of you will, but that Maryland, in the first federal Congress, was represented by, in the House, by one of its 6 members in the House, was Michael Jennifer Stone, and he owned a plantation called Equality, filled with slaves. And it embodied the new nation's haunting mutual constitution of race and democracy from the start, as the great historian Edmund Morgan put the point, and I quote, "Republican freedom in the United States came to be supported at least in large part by its opposite, slavery." And this dual and mutual constitution of freedom and slavery haunts America. And no one in my lifetime has illuminated this mutual constitution better than Eric Foner. And for that, not just we as a Columbia community, or we as historians and social scientists, or we as scholars, or we as Americans, but we collectively who care about the capacities and the incapacities of the Western liberal tradition are in his profound debt. The Talmud, with this being Friday evening, I can follow Seth's, he referred to Menschlichkeit. I will continue in a somewhat rabbinical tradition by reminding us that certainly in Talmudic discussions, which impel us to say or to express debts in public, or else they've not been discharged. I was a freshman at Columbia College in the same academic year that Eric graduated Columbia. Alice Kessler Harris, who's here, may remember that at her retirement event, I said that, quoting Joan Baez on Bob Dylan, that she had burst on the scene already a legend. Well, I can tell you that as a freshman at Columbia College, Eric was already a legend, especially for those of us who cared about and thought we might even major in history. Even then, I think, but especially over decades, he's approached history with a love of discovery. He loves archival discovery, with a love of rigor, no false facts for Professor Foner, not even counterfactual facts for Professor Foner, a love of felicitous prose, which he may have learned in part from his most important mentor, Richard Hofstadter, a love of freedom, and a love of learning and teaching. And that constellation of affections was already manifest when he was a kid, and it's deepened and grown over the years, and for those of us who don't equal his capacities, it has served as a motivation, a challenge, and an inspiration. And the final thing I want to say is that first-rate historians, great historians like Eric, really contribute to our collective life in 4 distinctive ways. Of course, first, they deepen scholarship, they deepen understanding, and whether it's to do with traditions of free soil or traditions of the meaning of Reconstruction, or understanding what somewhat elusive, even despite thousands of books written about him, the elusiveness of Lincoln on slavery, subject after subject, Eric Foner has deepened scholarship. But second, like many other considerable historians over time, as different as Charles Beard or Hofstadter for that matter, Eric has brought a historical imagination to bear on large, giant public questions. And third, he's, from the start of his teaching career at City College and here, he's built the capacity of others, undergraduates through his brilliant teaching, and graduate students through complementary but different kind of brilliant teaching. There is a generational lineage. Just look in his office at the PhD theses sponsored by Eric Foner. It's extraordinary. And then finally, Eric, truly, and not just because we're gathered to say nice things, more than any historian I know, has managed to communicate to multiple publics, advanced high school students, college students reading his beautifully realized textbook, the general public, has communicated what historians do, what we know, and what we teach. And that combination, this fertile, rich combination, is really quite distinctive. And I'm thrilled that we've gathered to celebrate this rare person who's contributed this to all of us and to many others. Now on to the first panel. Unfortunately, Lonnie Bunch could not be here because of an illness in the family. And in a moment, I'll read from his remarks. He is, as you know, the founding director of the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, and previously served as president of the Chicago Historical Society. And if you haven't been to the Washington Museum, hasten and do go. The four speakers we will hear from the podium, I'll introduce now and then simply come up when as turn comes. Nancy Foner, not without a relationship to the Foner on the other side of the room, is professor of sociology at Hunter College and the City University Graduate Center, and one of our most distinguished students of questions of immigration. Katrina vanden Heuvel. I could give a very long introduction, dear Katrina, but I will simply say editor and publisher of The Nation, and otherwise not a bad egg. Julie Kushner, director of Region 9A of the UAW, a union about which we have heard, and that the union that represents the support staff on campus as well as graduate teaching and research assistants here at Columbia. And Sean Wilentz, yet another major historian, professor of history at Princeton, who I am pleased to report, for those who don't know, is also a graduate of Columbia College. Now, if my iPad will work, I'd just like to read from some of Lonnie Bunch's remarks. It goes like this. Like most noted historians, Eric Foner has authored dozens of books and has taught American history at major universities nationally and around the world. But Eric is unlike most noted historians, for he has used his knowledge and scholarship to transform public history. Eric has redefined our opportunities as historians to impact the greater human good. His work has inspired all of us and future generations to be innovative in our fields, to become civic-minded, to channel our expertise into the kind of action that ultimately changes America for the better. His work with exhibitions and films has gone beyond the boundaries of traditional practice, and the field is forever indebted to Eric for his willingness to step outside those boundaries and chart a new path for us all. And then he lists at some length various exhibitions, House Divided, film work of Eric on Black New Orleans and the Civil War and the American West. And then he concludes with these remarks. Eric's dedication to the story of America has sparked a new wave of national curiosity in the way in which we qualify and understand public history and even public space. One of President Obama's final acts as President of the United States was the creation of a national monument to the Reconstruction era in Beaufort County, South Carolina. This act was in large measure inspired by Eric's relentless commitment to help us remember the Reconstruction era. Last fall, we opened the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Like Eric's work, the stories in the museum illuminate the dark corners of America's past to remember, honor, celebrate the story of resilience and triumph in that is our national heritage. The museum seeks to help all Americans remember, and by remembering, this institution will stimulate a dialogue about race and foster a spirit of reconciliation and healing. And he closes by thanking his friend in the following way. Eric's work demonstrates my heartfelt belief that there is nothing more powerful than a people, than a nation steeped in its history, and there is nothing nobler than honoring all our ancestors by remembering. Eric, your decades of work as an historian, filmmaker, and co-curator gives my work credibility, and I celebrate every contribution you have made to this nation, indeed to the world. In that spirit. And now,
I'm very honored to have been asked to speak at this open plenary session celebrating the career of Eric Foner, people's historian and historian's historian, and also, as many of you know, my cousin. I've been asked to talk about the Foner family history and legacy, something that was a major factor in why Eric became a historian in the first place, and also why he took the path he did as a scholar, focusing on African American history, slavery, and Reconstruction, as well as issues of civil rights and freedom. The Foner family, as many of you also probably know, is a well-known family on the New York left. The two oldest brothers, Jack, who was Eric's father, and actually there were some pictures of Jack up there before, Jack, Eric's father, and Phil, were identical twins, and they were leading historians. My father, Mo, and our uncle Henry, who I should say only died a few months ago at the age of 97, both Mo and Henry were important figures in the labor movement. The Foner brothers were sons of Jewish immigrants from what was then Russia and is now Poland, and they grew up in the Williamsburg section of Brooklyn, before clearly it was trendy. Their father, Abraham, was a seltzer man who, delivering seltzer in a horse-drawn wagon and lugging the bottles up many flights of tenement stairs, and later he ran a garage with a partner in downtown Brooklyn. Even before the four Foner brothers' achievements as historians and union leaders, they became famous on New York's left for being among the several dozen faculty members and staff at New York City colleges who lost, resigned from, or were denied jobs in the early 1940s, and this was after being investigated by New York State's Rap-Couder Committee, which sought to purge what the committee saw as communist subversion in higher education. This was, before its time, McCarthyism before McCarthy. One of the complaints, in fact, against Jack, Eric's father, was that his teaching devoted excessive attention to the role of African Americans in American history. Not only did the Foner brothers lose their jobs at the time, but afterwards they sought to make ends meet by playing in a band, which they called, the band had actually been in existence before, but now they called the band Suspended Swing. And they played in the Catskills small hotel circuit. As my father once said, they used to say that the Foner brothers had the highest intellectual quotient and the lowest musical quotient. Given their low musical quotient, the band didn't last that long. For Jack, Eric's father, however, the blacklist lasted much longer. Both Jack and Phil were unable to get academic jobs for several decades. It was only after many years as a freelance lecturer on history and politics, and Jack had a very devoted following throughout the New York area, that Jack was able to return to academic life, which he did at Colby College, where he established the first Black Studies program in New England. It was in listening to his father's lectures, Eric has written, that he came to appreciate how studying the past can illuminate the present, how the civil rights movement, just to give one example, should be viewed in light of the struggles of Black and white abolitionists, and also how a commitment to social justice can infuse attitudes toward the past. Even everyday life in the Foner family was about political and social justice issues. There's the story that our Uncle Henry tells, and he tells this in, I don't know how many of you have seen this, Ken's Burn documentary on baseball. And this is about a Foner family Passover Seder in 1947. Neither Eric or I were at this Seder, needless to say. But in answer to the traditional question, why is this night different from all other nights, Henry chimed in, because today Jackie Robinson integrated baseball. In speaking about the blacklist that affected both his father and his mother, and I should add that Lisa, Eric's mother, had been a high school art teacher, and she was blacklisted as well as Jack. Eric has written that his parents' experience with the blacklist made clear to him at an early age the gap between America's professed ideals as a land of liberty and actual social and political realities. In an essay on his life as a historian, Eric wrote of a Hungarian friend who grew up in communist Hungary, remarking that he was raised in a country where he understood that most of what the government said was untrue. That's funny, Eric replied. I grew up in the same country. Still, for Eric, and I should say also for me, it was a badge of honor in intellectual and progressive circles in New York to be the child of one of the Foner brothers. With Jack writing on African American history, including on African Americans in the military, Phil, whose daughter actually is, I can't see, is out here, Laura, writing on a prolific author of books on African American and labor history, including a multi-volume history of the American labor movement and the life and times of Frederick Douglass, and my father and Henry, key figures in labor union activism in New York. Henry, for many years, was the president of the Fur and Leather Workers Union, and my father, Mo, was a leader of the Health and Hospital Workers Union and a founder and leader of the Bread and Roses cultural program. And as I've said, our family was steeped in politics. This is in the middle of this is a story that in the middle of Thanksgiving dinner one year at my parents' house, when all the Foner brothers were there with their wives, Eric wasn't there. I think I was the only one of our generation there. In the middle of the dinner, the table collapsed, and all of the food went on the floor. All the dishes went on the floor. There was 2 seconds of silence, and after the 2 seconds, the political discussion and the arguments began again. For much of my life, whenever I would meet people of my parents' generation, and when I was giving talks, when I was teaching classes, when I was in various social situations in New York, at least one person would invariably come up to me and ask, "Are you one of the Foners?" And then the next question was always, "Who is your father?" But I should say, for at least the last dozen years, there's been a different question. And that question is, are you related to Eric Foner? So I'm proud to say then that I was, and I'm sad to say now that I am. So congratulations, Eric, on your remarkable career and also to your career in the years ahead.
That was wonderful. It is an honor to be here for this celebration. Retirement, we call it the Foner Fest at the Nation. Another longtime Nation contributor, Gore Vidal, liked to call this the United States of amnesia. Even more than in other places, this country has been formed not by what it remembers, it chooses to remember of its own past, by what it chooses to forget. And in such a country, in such times, simply to remember is itself a radical act. It is to refuse to submit to the blinders that the powers that be are always trying to slip onto the rest of us. It is to subvert, implicitly or otherwise, the tyranny of the present, to insist on expanding the realm of the possible. And if all of this is true, and I submit that it is, then Eric Foner is one of the most dangerous men in America. And I submit that he is. Eric's impact on the study of American history, and in particular on the study of the American Civil War and its aftermath, is impossible to measure. His work on the formation of the Republican Party, on the radicalism of Tom Paine, on Reconstruction, on American freedom, on Abraham Lincoln, on the Underground Railroad, and so much else will be read for decades to come, even centuries to come. And my own understanding and appreciation of our past, both the glories and the hiccups, has been shaped by the arguments Eric has put forward and by the stories he has told. Stories he tells with cool passion, precision, openness to argument, good humor. Yet it is not Eric Foner, the widely influential people's historian, historian's historian, I want to raise a glass to today, tomorrow. Others will speak to the importance of his field, shaping interventions in various debates. I want to add something else. On top of his other laurels, the Bancroft, the Parkmans, the Pulitzers, I want to add another distinction of Eric Foner being one of the most indispensable political commentators in the United States in these last 40 years. His public political writing has never been a sideline or digression from his scholarly historical work. It springs from the same deep commitment to a radical sense of justice. Eric isn't interested in effacing the political in his own scholarship or presenting his work as neutral products of mere curiosity about the past. He shows that another route is possible, that we need not sever the connection between past and present. The best history and the best politics emerges from a dialogue between the two, and it is in his commitment to that dialogue that Eric has helped to shape a generation of American historians, dissidents, journalists, activists, troublemakers, eminent figures. Now, this idea of Eric as a political commentator may or may not surprise those here, but there are so many who first encountered Eric's work in the library in journals like Civil War History or the Journal of American History. But for the many thousands of Americans who first read him in the pages, who first read him in the pages of a magazine whose first issue was published in 1865. That pivotal year in the life of this country when a group of abolitionists came together and decided they needed a magazine to continue their struggle for human freedom and equality in the age of emancipation. This new magazine would be dedicated to covering what an editorial in its very first issue called, quote, the conflict of ages, the great strife between the few and the many, between privilege and equality, between law and power, between opinion and the sword. And while remaining conscientiously loyal to its other mission, quote, the topics of the day with greater accuracy and moderation that are now to be found in the daily press we must cover. No, quote, alternative facts for this magazine, thank you very much. The weekly would nonetheless take sides in that conflict of ages. The abolitionists gave the magazine a name to match their ambitions for the reconstructed United States. It was called The Nation. And much has changed in 152 years for the nation, and the nation, as we like to say, but we continue to think of our mission as continuing the battle for emancipation, the battle for freedom. And here, I am contractually obligated to note that, quote, Battles for Freedom, the Use and Abuse of American History, a collection of Eric's many articles and essays for the nation over the last 40 years, is available for sale at a table in the lobby. The reviews are terrific. In that battle I spoke of, Eric has wielded his pen like a sword. His first contribution to the magazine, exactly 40 years ago, was a reconsideration of the case of Sacco and Vanzetti 50 years after their tragic execution. In 1993, Eric used the 130th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation to call for a, quote, third Reconstruction, following the first one in the 1860s, which he had already written about so compellingly, and the second in the 1960s. Nothing less was needed now, he wrote, than a renewed national effort to address the racial divide that afflicts our society. Yet such an effort would require, Foner acknowledged, the kind of moral leadership and political courage this generation is unaccustomed to in its presidents. A quarter century after he wrote that dazzling essay, we're still waiting for that third reconstruction. Thanks to the wisdom of the great Nation editor, publisher emeritus, Victor Navasky, Eric joined the magazine's editorial board in 1996. He has been a wise board member, bringing history to bear when needed, interjecting a Foner-esque radical pragmatism into our discussions of movement and electoral politics, endorsement decisions, various controversies. He has never failed to remind us that at a time when the old consensus has cracked open, the nation's number one thing must be to put forward an alternative view and vision. On the nation's 150th anniversary, over a series of Metro Diner breakfasts, one of our favorite hangouts, Eric guided my editorial comrade Don Gutenplan to themes, ideas, and readings which informed our special anniversary issue. He made sure I knew the nation had in fact been on the wrong side of some of the great battles, had been in fact the voice of plutocracy, reactionary republicanism for several of its early decades. I had known this, but in the US of amnesia spirit, I had hoped to suppress remembering. Eric doesn't permit that. And his luminous contribution to the 150th issue, Freedom's Song, reminded us of how over the nation and the nation's history, each new generation of radicals and reformers has contested the promise and the meaning of freedom. After the selection of George W. Bush by the Supreme Court in 2000, Foner, the political commentator, wrote within weeks of the September 11 attacks a piece for the nation called The Most Patriotic Act. Our civil rights and civil liberties are the inheritance of a long history of struggles, Eric wrote, by abolitionists for the ability to hold meetings and publish their views in the face of mob violence, by labor leaders for the power to organize unions, picket, and distribute literature without fear of arrest, by feminists for the right to disseminate birth control information without being charged with violating the obscenity laws, and by all those who braved jail and worse to challenge entrenched systems of racial inequality. And he reminded us that, quote, at times of crisis, the most patriotic act of all is the unyielding defense of civil liberties, the right to dissent, and equality before the law for all Americans. It's hard to overstate, I think it is, how brave it was to write such things at a time when the drumbeat of war was ringing out all over the land. For his troubles, Eric found himself on a list of the most dangerous professors in America, an accomplishment for which I know he was rightfully proud. He was also proud of being described more recently by the Columbia Spectator as, quote, a general all-around cool cat. That would be in an article titled, quote, How Foner Sort of Feels the Burn. Before I end, I would be remiss if I did not bring up that Eric has been unfailingly generous with his time, his words, his counsel, and as some have said, reminded us, given his global fame, it is truly remarkable how unpretentious Eric is. He's also a masterful and speedy email correspondent, and often one of mordant wit. In one of his late-night emails, and I don't mean to leak this, but ostensibly about organizing a nation event at the Schomburg, Eric asked in a PS, by the way, did you ever see Lincoln the Vampire Hunter? Totally absurd. Mary Lincoln and Harriet Tubman bring silver bullets to the Union troops at Gettysburg to defeat a vampire Confederate army? But oddly, Eric wrote, it gives more of a sense of slavery than that Spielberg movie. So let me end by saying there's one more article Eric has written for The Nation that I really want to highlight, only because it exemplifies how unique and important his voice has been. In November 2015, just as Bernie Sanders was climbing in the polls, taking everyone, including himself, by surprise, Eric emailed me, Quote, thinking about the democratic debate, if you or anyone else at the Nation has a way of communicating with Bernie, he needs to revise his approach when talking about radicalism and socialism. Forget about Denmark. So I asked Eric to pen an open letter to Bernie for the Nation. And in it, he asked Sanders to stop appealing to the example of Denmark. I mean, I love Denmark, we all love Denmark, but stop appealing as inspiration for what he was proposing. Instead, Eric wisely suggested that Sanders ground what he was saying in American radical traditions, our own radical history. Talk about abolitionists, populists, feminists, Debs, the New Deal, with all of its limitations, the Great Society, its King's critique of wealth and poverty and militarism in America. Refer to the populist Omaha Platform of 1892, which sounds like it could have been written today. So Eric wrote, Bernie, quote, please talk about our radical forebears here in the United States because the most successful radicals have always spoken the language of American society and appealed to some of its deepest values. Eric Foner has spoken that language too, and he has enriched it in invaluable ways by telling the story of our most fundamental values, the story of American freedom, in the title of one of his greatest books. And he has imbued this story with warmth, rigor, new rigor, new importance, and all of us at the Nation, everywhere are in Eric's debt. Thank you.
I have some props. But before I begin, I think there's someone out there who is prepared to show a short video. So let's roll video. Wrong one. Whoever's operating that. I know I wasn't there for that.
What the union has taught me in the Columbia campaign, is that I have the ability to make a change, and I have the ability with my coworkers to make a change and make an improvement. So I feel good, I feel much better, I feel much more grown up.
Throughout the nation, traditionally unorganized clerical and university support staff, mostly women, many of us minority workers, are looking to unions to improve our working conditions. At Columbia University, where I work.
What the union has taught me in the Columbia campaign, is that I have the ability to make a change, and I have the ability with my coworkers to make a change and make an improvement. So I feel good, I feel much better, I feel much more grown up.
Throughout the nation, traditionally unorganized clerical and university support staff, mostly women, many of us minority workers, are looking to unions to improve our working conditions. At Columbia University, where I work as an administrative assistant, 1,100 support staff joined District 65 UAW to put an end to our low salaries, lack of advancement opportunities, and to discrimination that affected minorities, women, and long-term workers.
Clerical workers, in a sense, the better they do their job, the more invisible they are. You have a letter typed, you have a final exam Xeroxed, you know, or you go and find your grades posted. And the fact that someone is actually, you know, working hard and effectively to do this doesn't really occur to you until they're gone, or until you begin to think about what salary they're earning, what benefits they don't have for this. And I think the whole effect of the strike, the organization campaign and the strike itself, was to make people just think about these workers as human beings and fellow workers on the campus rather than just kind of invisible, anonymous people.
We became stronger as students and faculty were convinced that our demands were fair. Their support grew day by day.
The most dramatic way, I think, that faculty members supported the strike was taking classes off campus. In other words, refusing to cross the picket line to teach. I was involved in organizing that, and we had, I can't remember exactly, probably 450 to 500 classes meeting off campus. It represented both a desire to keep the educational process going, but also not to allow the university to claim that business as usual was going on while the strike was in progress.
And I think what's important at a victory party is to think a little bit about our victory and what it's meant. I found that the Columbia workers were willing to stand up for important principles. Principles of affirmative action, principles of decent minimum starting rates, and the idea that women and men and blacks and whites and Hispanics should all make equal pay for the kind of work that you're doing, and that there shouldn't be discrimination at the university, and that in fact there had been discrimination, and we would expose it and we would begin to eliminate it. And I think that you all should be congratulated for
I'm excited because for the first time, we will be getting increases across the board for everyone, and it will not be based on favoritism. For the first time, we have respect for our skills, and it's a wonderful feeling. It's marvelous. Let's hear it for the first time.
I had no idea that you had only recently become faculty again at Columbia, and that you weren't that old either. But at the time, it was so impressive to me that you were going to stand with us. And I don't even remember whether we sought you out or whether you sought us out. It is impossible to recall. But what was very clear is that Eric, from the very beginning, was not just a faculty member, not just an intellectual, not just an amazing historian, but he was an organizer himself in the true tradition of the Foner family. And I think that when he speaks on this video, what I found so impressive is he very modestly says, and we got about 500 classes off campus. And, you know, that sounds like, oh, that's interesting, that's a good thing to do. But what I think you all need to appreciate is that it didn't happen without Eric's incredibly hard work and organizing skills. He called all those faculty members, which, you know, he called his colleagues, that's one thing. But what shocked me was when I would come in the office and see Eric calling movie theaters and calling restaurants and calling a bowling alley and St. John the Divine and even the West End Bar, where we had to locate these hundreds and hundreds of classes. And he did all this and figured out the whole schedule, and we did not even have an Excel spreadsheet. So I think it was an amazing feat and very, very remarkable. And it was that kind of work that Eric contributed to our success, and we've never forgotten it, and we feel a great debt of gratitude to you, Eric, for bringing those skills to our campaign and also bringing your inspiration to our campaign. After the strike was over and the party was over, and by the way, Eric came to almost every big meeting we ever had, and he would get up and, as a faculty member, encourage people to get out there and get involved. And you know, you were one of the few people who could combine the ability to do the work and to do the organizing, and also to come to a meeting like that and inspire so many people to be brave and to take action. And after the strike was over, you invited me to lunch, which also was like a really big deal to me. It was in a really fancy restaurant, and now that I look back, it probably wasn't that fancy, but it seemed really fancy at the time. It wasn't like fast food. And we sat there, and I remember you said to me, you should write a book about this. And I looked at you and said, no, I'm not going to write a book. And I remember you said, well, could you write an article? And I thought, you know, you were still organizing me. I never wrote that book, and I never wrote an article. It took me a great deal just to write remarks for tonight, and I even screwed up and didn't get those in on time. But there wouldn't have been one chapter to that book, because a book about Eric Foner at Columbia and the labor movement would have had many, many chapters. We've had many strikes, many struggles, and in each case, Eric has been a part of it. Eric has been there with us each time. You know, we took a real bold new move in 2002 when I remember calling Eric and saying, well, we're organizing the graduate workers here on campus. And I was a little nervous because, in fact, you were sort of a boss at that point, you know, because you had graduate workers working under your supervision, and it made me a little nervous. Like, is he going to be like sometimes really progressive liberal guys who become bosses aren't so comfortable when their workers start organizing? And I'm really familiar with that. And but in true Eric Foner tradition, he was, what can I do to help? And he totally embraced it. He wasn't unaware of it, of course. He was fully aware of what was going on, and he embraced the campaign, and in 2002 made every effort to try and bring this university to a point where they could recognize that there's value in having unionized workforce and value in having unionized graduate workers. And you know, that fight continues today. I met President Bollinger for the first time today, and you know, we had an election in December, and we won that election by an amazing margin, bigger than any I've ever experienced. 1,602 to 623, so almost 1,000 votes. And even during that election, I was quite nervous. And I'm sure, Eric, you recall, we had coffee, which was, I know all the organizers were aggravated with me because they were like out there working so hard, and I was having coffee with Eric Foner, you know, and it was like, but it was really a great moment for me because I was anxious. I was anxious about the election of President Trump, and I was anxious about the Harvard graduate election, and I was anxious about the election that was taking place right at that moment. And Eric was so, he just saw the big picture. He saw that this is just, we're just playing, we're just actors in a really big stage, and that this is just a moment. And those weren't his words, because I can't repeat your words. They were much more articulate than that. And yet they were very plain and simple and calming to me, and helping me to understand that we have to do our best and fight our hardest for the values that and for the things we believe in, but that we can't ever get discouraged. And right after having coffee with you, I was at a Working Families Party event in Connecticut, and a dear friend of mine, who I think might even be here, Bob Master from the Communication Workers, he was being honored, and he ended his speech with quoting Eric Foner. And it really, I was so surprised. And he quoted an article from December from The Nation. So I thought I would read to you what Eric said in that article. And it was an article about the American radical. And he said, on the first page of the course syllabus, I always included the words of Max Weber. You know, I'm not an intellectual, so I'm sorry, I can't even say that, but you know who I mean. A rebuke to those who believe that critics of society should set their sights only on practical measures. Quote, what is possible would never have been achieved if, in this world, people had not repeatedly reached for the impossible. And I thought that quote was so perfect for Eric and for you to be acknowledged as someone who has really always taken on the impossible. And you have really inspired so many trade unionists, people who have organized. I know I saw friends here from Harvard Committee. I know Bob is here, and Rudy Batzel, and Tina Groger, and Maida Rosenstein, and June Benjamin, and you know, Lindsay from your department, all of these people that you have inspired in your work and in your life here at Columbia. And it goes on, your legacy will go on. And on behalf of my local union, Local 2110 of UAW, on behalf of the graduate workers of Columbia, and on behalf of the UAW, the United Auto Workers, I'd like to ask all you activists in the room who've been inspired by Eric to stand for a moment, and let's pay tribute to him. Eric, I said to you when I walked in, I think this is the first time in nearly 40 years that I've ever been on the program at Columbia University. I've demonstrated many times outside, but I couldn't be prouder than to be asked to be part of this program and to be part of this tribute to you. And in true trade union fashion, I came bearing gifts. I have a jacket for you. I don't know if we ever gave you a UAW jacket, but you're in luck. I'm the female director gets to pick the garb, and this one's very stylish. So we have a UAW jacket that says "Working Together for Justice," and we have pins for everybody in the room so that you can wear a UAW pin before you leave here tonight. Thank you, Eric.
Well, after all that, I'm supposed to talk about Eric's day job. I'm actually pinch hitting for Ira Berlin, who would have been very happy to be here, and I'm going to throw together some remarks about Eric Foner as an historian. I guess as a prelude for the rest of the conference, where we're actually going to be talking about history. And I was told to, asked to, and I'm really honored to be here. I mean, Eric is an old and dear friend, and certainly my greatest mentor, without question. So it's a real honor to be here. I just never thought this day would ever come, that we'd be seeing Eric retire, but he's not retiring, so that's fine. I was asked to talk about Eric Foner's contributions on the subjects of slavery, Civil War, and Reconstruction in 10 minutes. That's ridiculous. But actually, the subject's too confining. I mean, Eric is an historian of far more than slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. I mean, Eric's work covers the length and breadth of American history and a great deal more besides. He's written about international issues as well, in Give Me Liberty and the History of Freedom and so forth. I mean, there are very few historians these days, actually, who can write authoritatively, that have people believe them in writing about that much of American history, and Eric is one of those few. In a time of fragmentation and specialization, he takes the broad view in history as in life. He's certainly rooted, his work is rooted in the middle of the 19th century, from around 1830 to 1880 or so. But, you know, you cover a lot more, and everything you write about the entirety of American history informs what you write about that period and vice versa. So there's a wholeness to it, which is really quite extraordinary, and which I find very, very valuable. I'm glad that Katrina brought up, however, Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. Because I would have thought, Eric, that any movie where the Confederacy are a bunch of ghouls isn't so bad, let alone being taken down by the rail splitter. Anyway, Eric's work is not associated with any one idea. There is no Foner thesis, as there was a Turner thesis, those of you know about Frederick Jackson Turner, or an Elkins thesis. There is no Foner thesis about a particular problem. Rather, Eric's work, at least as far as I'm concerned, is attached to an entire approach to the past, an entire approach to history, of history being made by ordinary people, not in the way they would have liked it, but by their own wits and their own skill and their own fervor, being made by social movements, pressing from below, but not simply made by social movements, also being made by exceptional leaders like Abraham Lincoln, and being made in high politics like the Republican Party. Ideas are always central to Eric's work in history. Ideas. Ideas as rooted in social and material life and in interest, but never reducible to them. Ideas have an independence that is importance. Ideas appear as ideology, but not in the narrow sense of a doctrine, but more like a worldview, or as we used to say, a Weltanschauung. But it's never monolithic. It's never static. It's always in motion. And it's always open to the more volatile play of ideas. This is very difficult to do all at once, let me tell you. But describing that, that's basically the way that historians, American historians, I think, try to go about their work these days. That's what we all try to do. And what we all try to do, I think, owes much to Eric's own practice as a historian. Now, his own work, of course, has evolved over the years. Your work has evolved. You started off writing about politics, political parties, and party ideologies, touched by, later, by the social and cultural turn that we associated with E.P. Thompson and Herbert Gutman, looking at the agency of people, people making their own history, as opposed to history being made from above, all of which you synthesize beautifully in your grand history of Reconstruction, which I see as, that 60s, 70s moment being made flesh in American history better than anybody. It's the Making English Working Class for America. That's as close as we're going to get, is your book on Reconstruction, and it's all very much there. Always emphasizing the primacy of ordinary African Americans, free blacks from before the war, but also ex-slaves. Absolutely central to it. But also always interested in power and in politics. U.S. Grant is in there too, and he's important. All of this coming full circle to The Fiery Trial, the book for which you were awarded the Pulitzer Prize, on Abraham Lincoln. From the Republican Party at the beginning, and now we end up with Abraham Lincoln. We've come full circle, but what a journey it has been. Ending up with, I think, a more appreciative view of Lincoln than you might have had given before, a man grappling with the enormity of slavery, but also showing how an individual can give shape and substance to ideology and politics, how leadership matters, and how Lincoln was an extraordinary leader. So all of this is what's going on in his work. Now, what about slavery? And what about the Civil War? And what about Reconstruction? Slavery. Actually, not so much, and I'll explain. Not so much. I mean, it's true that Eric came of age to history right at the point when slavery was being placed at the center of our understanding of American history. American historians had kept it out. The progressive generation, Charles Beard and others, had just kept slavery out of the picture altogether. Others, try to laugh it off. They try to do that. Then a generation of liberal historians came along in the 1940s and 1950s, Kenneth Stamp, even your own teacher, Richard Hofstadter, in his piece on U.B. Phillips. This is a little inside baseball, folks, but this is fun for me. Talking about slavery as an important problem in American history that could not be pushed aside. Then, of course, there was a whole other tradition coming out from the left of E.W.B. Du Bois, leading up to Herbert Aptheker, Genovese, who was getting on, Eugene D. Genovese. This was all popping at the time that Eric came into the movement, into studying history. And of course, the Civil Rights Movement, everything was going on outside in the world, was doing all of that. And Eric was very much a part of all of that. But Eric's work, to me, is about the history of anti-slavery. Anti-slavery, the opposition to slavery. Here, I think, is the core, not just of Eric's early work, but really of your work for the last 50 years in understanding that. Now, you may not know this, but his first paper, and he writes a senior thesis and it gets published. This doesn't happen that often. But it was on the Free Soil Party, racial attitudes of the Free Soilers, trying to get at the dark side of anti-slavery politics, its racism, but not settling for easy answers about that either. Not saying they were simply a bunch of racists, but understanding the complexity of anti-slavery politics at a time when anti-slavery politics are not being written about terribly well. I mean, most of you are probably too young to remember this, but there was a time when abolitionists were thought of either a bunch of cranks, madmen, lunatics, misfits, or people who simply were suffering from status anxiety, who weren't fitting in that way. That was what people were writing about the anti-slavery movement and about the abolitionist movement at this time. It was a beginning of heroizing the abolitionists. Stoughton Lynd was doing this, others. But anti-slavery was not in terribly good odor until Eric Foner came along. Eric saw the abolitionists in particular as part of a very complex movement, part of a coalition that was going to end up in the Republican Party, pushing the Republican Party, advancing freedom, but within a very particular social and ideological construct, that of free labor, the center of your first book. Free labor could have been tossed aside, as many people did, as just capitalism, as it's another form of hierarchy and oppression. What Eric did from the beginning in studying anti-slavery is to see the ambiguities, the possibilities, the antinomies of that movement in a way that I think is really quite extraordinary. It's very hard to own that kind of irony and ambiguity in talking about politics, let alone radical politics, and you did it. So, he's the historian of anti-slavery. But part of that was an abiding interest in the history of American radicalism. And I think actually in many ways Eric's greatest contribution overall has been as a historian of American radicalism. It came up in the talks earlier about, going back and getting all of that done. Well, now this too grows out of a moment. It grows out of your family, above all, but it grows out of the moment, the Civil Rights Movement, Columbia 68, all of that stuff. But it was also intellectual. It was also intellectual. Eric studied with Richard Hofstadter, who was the great historian of his generation, much as Eric is a great historian of his generation. And Hofstadter was the best of the so-called consensus historians. He had an idea that basically he wrote a very important book called The American Political Tradition, which is a very radical book about the failure of liberalism in America, more than anything else. Eric wanted to write about that kind of history, but in a very different way. What Hofstadter and his generation were doing was showing the limits of change in America. You could only go so far until you hit up against private property, and that was the end of everything. Eric was interested in finding out how things did change, why things changed. He was in effect trying to redeem a radical tradition that had been written out. Even by people who admired those various ideas, they saw no possibility for it. Well, Eric devoted himself to that from the very beginning. He had respect for what those people were writing, but he was interested in the well springs of change. You may not know this, but Eric, very early on, intended to write a book. Hofstadter had written a book called The American Political Tradition. Eric was going to write a book entitled The American Radical Tradition. The first chapter of that book was going to be about Tom Paine. And Eric being Eric, that chapter turned into an entire book. But seeing again within Paine ways in which central ideas like respect for private property could be taken in very different directions, leading in Paine's case to an egalitarianism in which an attack on aristocracy becomes the prologue to a democratic politics beyond anything thought practicable, let alone desirable, by the revolutionary leadership. Born of ideas, but also the experience of artisan shops and taverns and debating halls. And then going on from there to talk about abolitionism, not simply as contributing to the Republican Party, but as the quintessential form of American radicalism. I mean, I think for Eric, abolitionism is the template for all American radical movements, and he built his history out of that. All right. So much for slavery. The Civil War, well, obviously connects. The coming of the war was about the history of anti-slavery and radicalism. That was there. The Civil War didn't happen because people were fighting over the tariff. But if they were fighting over slavery, they were only fighting over slavery because something like an anti-slavery movement had come along, which in the history of the world, it's a pretty extraordinary thing. Slavery had been tolerated for millennia as absolutely normal. Go back and read your Aristotle, absolutely normal. Something happened in America about the time of the American Revolution, and that changed things enormously. I gather you wanted to entitle your dissertation at first, The Political Economy of Anti-Slavery, is that right? Yeah, so he was playing off of what Eugene Genovese's first book was, The Political Economy of Slavery, but he was going to look at it from a very different angle, looking at a democratic politics unlike any before it, in a free labor society unlike any before it. In effect, linking Paine and Lincoln. It all pushed to the point where it achieved national political power, prompting the counter-revolution that was secession and the undoing of an old nation and a republic which tolerated slavery and became dominant and had been dominated by slaveholders. And then, of course, Reconstruction follows. So I'm getting to the third, the making of that new nation, where there were radical ideas galore. There are radical ideas all over the place, including taking the land and redistributing it, attacking private property. So in the end, maybe it wasn't so true what those old guys were saying. With ordinary African Americans very much at the forefront, a genuine revolution that was thwarted but not eradicated, rather left unfinished for future generations. So, a couple of years ago, my university had the sagacity to award Professor Foner an honorary degree. One of many he has awarded, but one I'm particularly proud of. And they asked me to write the encomium to this. You may not have known that I wrote the encomium, but I did. And I tried to sum up Eric's historical contributions as follows. I said that his career honors his subject, and with them, the dictum of Frederick Douglass that, quote, if there is no struggle, there is no progress. Well, in paying tribute to Eric today, I just want to end on a note of struggle. But that's the struggle of writing history. The struggle of writing history. It's a struggle that many historians, we like to shove it off. I mean, we have a pretty easy job, all in all. But you know, it's very, very hard work. It's very hard work, mastering vast archives, giving them shape and coherence, writing about them with lucidity. If we are apt to downplay how difficult it is, I want to say today how hard it is. And how much, with an historian like Eric, far more talented than I could ever hope to be, has endured through that struggle, not just coming up with the books that he did, but doing so with such generosity, such ease, such open-mindedness, and such effortlessness that it's truly astonishing. He has done more for American history than anyone else, certainly of his generation, but he has done it with consuming class. And for that, I am especially grateful. Thank you.
Well, what an extraordinary start. I'd like to thank Nancy and Katrina and Julie and Sean for introducing us to a multifaceted, warm-hearted, lovely scholar and person. Before turning over to Manisha, who's going to introduce a movie for us, I just want to say that in listening to these speakers, there were three kind of sensibilities brought together, and I'll say this in a more abstract way than talk about Eric. There's the sensibility of a quest for justice. There are philosophers who write about theories of justice, Amartya Sen, John Rawls, and others. And Eric, in that sense, he may not like what I'm about to say, is a philosophical historian, thinking about possibility, but possibility that has a certain kind of normative ambition and abstraction worthy of the best philosophers. But Eric also, as we heard about union organizing and other factors, is a pragmatist. His feet are on the ground and not just up in the sky. He has the sensibility of a person who works step by step, class by class, student by student, movement by movement, to get us to where that philosophical imagination about the good and the just might take us. But finally, Eric, in his work, has stared hard at human cruelty. And he understands that quest for justice and quest for pragmatism always face circumstances where things can get worse and not better, in which human beings, alas, have the capacity to do great harm to each other. And in that sense, his work can be read not only in the spirit of philosophers of justice or pragmatists striving to improve, but also in the spirit, say, of the late political theorist Judith Shklar, who wrote about a liberalism of fear, in which the passion is not just to make things better, but to prevent the most cruel things from dominating. And it's that fusion that we've just been hearing and listening to, and that makes it such an honor to participate in the celebration of Eric Foner. Thank you.
He actually walks the walk. So I would now like to sort of briefly introduce, not a movie, a video clip on Eric Foner, created when the Columbia College Alumni Association awarded him the Alexander Hamilton Medal for distinguished service to the Columbia College community. And I believe Hamilton's stock has been raised considerably recently, so that's a good medal to get. In any case, this video actually captures beautifully what makes Eric such an influential historian and teacher. And I think it is just the right way to kickstart this conference. Now, a spoiler alert here. In my 6 years as a graduate student at Columbia, Eric was the only professor I ran into in the stacks at Butler Library on a regular basis. It's quite an unnerving experience if you're a graduate student. In any case, after this video, we will begin right away with the reception and the book signing by Eric for his new book, Battles for Freedom. Thank you.
Ernest Renan, the great French writer of the 19th century, wrote somewhere, "The historian is the enemy of the nation." I often quote that to my students. I said, what do you think Renan meant? The historian is the enemy of the nation. Is the historian a traitor or something like this? Well, eventually they figure out every nation is built on myth. Every nation is built on a kind of a created view of history which has some truth, but often obscures many aspects of the past. And then the historian comes along and says, well, no, you know, the history of the United States is not just the story of freedom, onward and upward forever. You know, we had slavery, folks. And moreover, it's not a straight line of more and more rights. People gain their rights, they lose their rights. It's much more complicated and more interesting, actually, because it's complicated. But a lot of people resent that. They are looking for what Nietzsche called monumental history. History that's just like a statue somewhere, you know, where you can come and admire it and feel good about yourself. That's not the job of a historian, to make people feel good about themselves. And I really am an archive sound. You look at all my books, you'll find very long bibliographies of primary sources, you know, and I really think that's where new discoveries lie. That's where a real in-depth sense of history at the local level lies. You know, my book on the Underground Railroad is funny because normally I start with a question or a set of issues, and then I say, well, how am I going to research this? Where are the archives? Where are the sources? In this case, it was the opposite. Thanks to an undergraduate student here, she was writing about this guy, Sidney Howard Gay, an abolitionist editor. She was interested in his journalistic career. But one day she said to me, you know, Professor, up in box 75 up there, there's these couple of notebooks which are called Record of Fugitives. And it turned out that Gay, this journalist, for 2 years was basically running the Underground Railroad in New York City, and for 2 years he kept a record of over 200 fugitive slaves who passed through his office. And being a journalist, he interviewed them. and you get the voice of these people in the midst of escaping from slavery. And I'd never seen a document quite like this, and I kind of worked outward from it.
1963, you can see what I look like. This is me, you and I graduated from Columbia College.
I took the core many, many years ago. It was fabulous. You know, I learned an enormous amount. I could mention John Locke or Adam Smith or Herodotus, you know, and students will know a little what I'm talking about.
This shelf here, going all the way across to the end, is books written by former students of mine, and it's really a sign of, you know, many of the things I've accomplished during my career as a teacher.
I don't see a great conflict, although some people do, between teaching and scholarship. They reinforce each other. Teaching good students like we have forces you to formulate your ideas in a coherent way.
So this is 1840? Yeah. Wow. That's a good way to test the revolution.
I do think knowledge of history is very valuable in thinking through some of the problems our society faces. And I think wherever there is history, I think historians ought to try to make sure it's good history. That's really